Welcome to our second episode in the summer series on the Constitution of American Life with us, the Friends of Publius. Although I believe it would be safe to say that collectively, the FOPs, or the Friends of Publius, believe every day provides a golden opportunity to discuss the American Constitution, its understanding and its challenges. But as we record this episode today, on the creation of the Constitution, we are in the midst of a treasure trove of current challenges to our constitutional way of life. First, we have, of course, the classic separation of powers as the Congressional Committee investigates January 6th. So we have the power of oversight, the power of investigation into the coup attempt of January 6, 2021. In the next few weeks, we will see before our very eyes what many believe will be a judicial revolution or counter-revolution, depending on how you see it, as the Supreme Court continues to redefine the Second Amendment, the right to privacy and autonomy, and affirmative action, while the Senate purportedly is close to passing the first gun safety law since the mid-1990s. And at the center of all of this, as always, is the federal system of government. So let us turn to today's discussion topic in Unit 2 of the We the People program, How Did the Framers Create the Constitution? Just a very simple overview of the chronology, students and teachers, and that is, so we got 1776, we declare independence. 1777, we have the writing and creation of our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And in a minute, gentlemen, I hope you'll comment. I'm wondering, in that interim period, are we in a hypothetical state of nature since we've rebelled against the previous form of government and we do not have necessarily a social contract until 1777. 1781, the Articles are ratified, finally, 4 years after they are first presented. 1787, we call for a Philadelphia Convention to amend the Articles of Confederation, and in 1788 we ratify our second and our current Constitution to the United States. So, Tim, if you want first, if you have some time to talk about, I'm just curious, are we in a state of nature in that interim period? But also, to what extent were the Articles, our first Constitution, a logical extension of ideas of the colonial and revolutionary experience?
Wow. Okay. No, we were not in a state. Well, yes and no. I'm sorry. I think your question, there's an assumption, and I think it's a very widespread assumption, David. I think when people talk about being under a social contract, there's always a national government default in that question. You know, did we have a national government? Well, no, but that doesn't mean we're in a state of nature, because states have constitutions. And frankly, states were writing constitutions a full year before the Declaration of Independence. So in a way, we are not in a state of nature, because at the state level, they decided very quickly, once the king declared the colonies outside his authority, the states, the colonies took that seriously and wrote constitutions so as to not be in a state of nature at the state level. So that's why it's kind of a yes and a no. We don't have a national social contract, but we do have plenty of state social contracts.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So there's, we always kind of have to snicker at the national government bias in how we view our history, that everything, there's nothing going on at the states. But
there were some states that went 3 or 4 years without a state constitution, right?
Right.
So are they functioning under colonial charters still?
Well, yeah, and a couple. I think Rhode Island, most notably, never did rewrite a constitution. They just used their charter. To your point, David, right? But your other question, I know it's infinitely more complicated, but I forget it. That's how.
To what extent is the Articles, all right, our first Constitution, a logical extension, all right, of the ideas developed through the colonial and revolutionary period?
Yeah, I think the standard answer there is actually it is a logical extension. There's a tremendous distrust of centralized national power. So there's two kinds of distrust. There's a distrust of Parliament, the national government for them, but there's also a distrust of each other. These are anything but United States or United Colonies. There's a long history of animosity between colonies. They have border fights throughout that colonial period. So I think it's a logical extension of their colonial experience of distrust of national power, but it's also distrust of each other that makes the sovereignty principles within the Articles a very logical extension of their colonial experience.
Well, in hindsight, would you agree, Tim, that the Articles is a better reflection of revolutionary principles than the Constitution of 1787-88?
Can I say yes and no without laughter?
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh.
Well, I do. I do. On that one single issue of local control. It's that local control that is the driving, and frankly, that local control issue, to your point in your opening comments, there's always this federalism feature within our system. So I think the local control is a key thing that drives this Articles. I mean, and the reality is we don't have an Articles till 81. When it's finally ratified by everybody. I think Maryland was the last to do so. So in a way, we don't have a national constitution, and the Second Continental Congress actually it has no rules whatsoever. I mean, they're literally operating without rules as a government, and they're not official in that regard.
So do they have any legitimate authority?
Well, during the war, there's a give and take on that too. At any given time, they're asking for all kinds of money, and states are saying, take a flying leap. We don't want to contribute our funds or men to fight. So it's a tenuous relationship between the Second Continental Congress's authority to the states. Absolutely.
So, Chris, staying kind of on that theme. To what extent, so let's look now at the structure of the Articles. To what extent was the organization and I guess the legal procedures, the procedural way government's supposed to work of the Philadelphia Convention consistent? And I guess that kind of similar to what I asked Tim. And that seems to me the question. Which of these two, the Philadelphia document or the Articles, is closer to colonial and revolutionary principles?
I would definitely go with the Articles. I think, and I'm going to go back a little further, David, to the question about the state of nature. I think if you think of the colonies / states, because we're in that process, that metamorphosis process, I think if you think of them as individuals, 13 individuals, I think you could describe it as a state of nature, because it's a very loose, all it takes is a couple of key states to say we're going to take our ball and go home, to really throw a monkey wrench into things. And the whole idea, and I've said this before in other programs, because I know Tim's big word is sovereignty, and I've come to embrace that word. I think if you think about the king as sovereign, then we have the struggle of sovereignty between the king and parliament. There's a giant urinating contest that happens in England. Eventually, Parliament wins that out. Creation of colonies. Colonies exist for a 150-year time period, at least on this side of the Atlantic. I understand that Great Britain had colonies around the world, but on this side of the Atlantic, there was that 150-year time period of salutary or benign neglect. And so, local control, which gets back to, which is going to lead us up to the Articles. And Tim just mentioned this. This is local control. We know what we're doing in our village and in our county, in our whatever our local place is. And then you see that sovereignty being wrested away from Parliament during the Revolution, and now it's fallen upon the states. And the states have that sovereignty. And this is why I think the Articles, back to your question, David, are a greater reflection of the revolutionary principles than the Constitution. And I think what you see happen in, whether it be the Annapolis Convention leading up to Philadelphia in 1787, in 87, is you start to see the idea of this sovereignty has gone too far and we need to rein it in somehow. But I think to your question, David, I do think the Articles are much more reflective of the revolutionary values than the Constitution itself.
Well, do you think the Confederation was a logical next step, or was it kind of extreme? I mean,
No,
obviously there was opposition to centralization or centralized power.
No,
But did they go too far in the
No, I don't think so. I think that was the very logical. I think, to use your word, I think it's a very logical step, because you have this local control, whether it be because of our charter, as Tim mentioned, with Rhode Island, our charters. I mean, all the 13. By the time the Revolution rolls around, Tim, you can correct me, but they were all royal colonies by that time, operating off their charters. And so, there's a strong push for this local control. We know what's best. And of course, you're dealing with people that didn't travel. I mean, for my goodness, for the next several generations, people didn't really travel very far. So I think it's a very logical step. The Articles are.
Yeah, there's three big events in 74, 75 that really I think are underestimated in terms of how they drive this localism in the Articles. 3 of the 4 intolerable acts passed by Parliament obliterate local control. The Administration of Justice Act said, you don't have local courts anymore. We're going to take you away somewhere else. The Massachusetts Legislature Act prorogued the Massachusetts legislature. This is Parliament doing these. Prorogued the Massachusetts legislature. That's an obliteration of local control. And the Quebec Act is really a heavy-handed act by Parliament that really runs afoul, not just of Massachusetts, but all over the colonies. They look at that as really losing control within their own backyard. So the heavy-handed of centralized power in 75, I think, really drives that Second Continental Congress to create the Articles. So I would see it as it's a matter of perspective, David. I think your question kind of assumes, we know the Constitution's coming down the road, so of course the Articles are an overreaction. Well, I'd say at the time, though, you have to understand how local control was threatened by those intolerable acts, and I'm saying that's lot. The Articles is a logical extension of those.
Well, I enjoy the slap. But I just want to I just want to make sure in 1781 nobody knows that the Philadelphia Convention is going to happen, and Hamilton writes quite an in-depth analysis of why the Articles are a bad gig.
And he's in the minority.
Okay,
there's a small group there. You're right, David. There's a small group of nationalists, and those Continentalist essays that you're referencing. You're exactly right that he's hasn't even been ratified. The Articles haven't even ratified, and he hates them. But the nationalists are in a minority in 81.
Chris,
David, just hold on to your question. I just want, for the students that may be watching this, hopefully there will be a couple. Tim's point about the courts in the very first part, and when you mentioned the intolerable acts, that the idea that the local court is being usurped, and fast forward to the debate in 87, 88, and we've had this discussion before, is that becomes, it's not a question about whether or not judicial review exists. It's going to be a question of who gets to exercise judicial review. Yeah. And we see that same debate in that argument. So I just want to throw that out there for people.
Mike?
Yeah, I think I know we've kind of taken this in numerous directions, but Chris but no, it's been good. Chris kind of laid out this idea of sovereignty, right? And how the progression of where sovereignty lies. And I was thinking about that in the context of, are the Articles closer to the revolutionary spirit than the Constitution, which is, I think, the way you framed the question, David. And I think there's an argument to be made. The Constitution is not a radical document. I'm not saying that at all. But the Constitution provides a place for at least the opportunity for the people to be sovereign, which to me is an idea that is closer to the revolution than the Articles providing a place for the states to be sovereign. So I know it doesn't happen overnight, and I don't think the Constitution necessarily reflects what the Declaration wanted. But in terms of the structure of government, the Constitution, it's we the people, right? It's not we the 13 states. So I think it's important for students to think about that element of the Constitution and about where we finally get sovereignty resting with the people rather than in the local states as well.
Well, Chris, I am curious because obviously by 1786, 1787, that minority that existed in 1781, it's grown, and they perceive the Articles as a failure. All right, that this system of government is failing. Do you agree with that? Do you think the Articles was a failure, and could we have continued on with the Articles and a few minor tweaks like the regulation of trade and the power of tax, and that's all we need in 1787, and we would have survived at least as long as the Constitution of 1787, which of course kind of falls apart in 1861. So what are your thoughts about the Articles?
Well, I think, you guys were talking about Hamilton a few minutes ago, and he was in a very small group when he's already complaining about the Articles before they're even ratified. But that group grows, right? That group grows, and then you get this really pretty influential guy. He's short, married a woman that's about 15 years younger than him, so he outkicked his coverage there. But you get Madison in there. So Madison's writing on the vices of the political, excuse me, and the vices of the political system. You get a Washington that's a little bit sympathetic to this. So I think what you see is that small group of people that were nationalists, to use that word Tim used, that was a dirty word back in the day, if you're especially for anti-federalists, you see that group grow, and that group grows and is influential. So I do, I'm still wrestling with something Mike said in my head because I disagree with him about
Me too.
the chance for the people to be sovereign. I'm not buying that. But I'm sorry, David, I lost track of your original question.
Well, again, this came up years ago, and Tim's boss / mentor, John Kaminsky, was asked whether or not we would have survived as a nation under the Articles with a few tweaks, and he surprised me by, in his words, saying, "Yeah, they could have."
Well, I don't disagree. I mean, I think it's interesting when you look at the orders that the guys that are on their way to Philadelphia, necessary for the exigencies of yada yada yada, right? And that's that little phrase in these orders given to these guys going off. And I know there are different states gave different orders, but they're very similar to that. And that's necessary for the exigencies of fixing stuff. That's doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I do think that had the national government been given a little bit more power in terms of trade, in terms of the finances, we might not have needed the Constitution.
Well, I mean, to be counterfactual, I think there were 6 formal attempts to amend the Articles in the 1780s. And 2 of them, and the most important one was this impost that was proposed in 83. And it comes very close to passing. And through a various long contorted explanation, it doesn't. So to be counterfactual, it's an interesting question to think about. If that impost would have passed, what it basically was we're not going to rely on the largesse of states to send in what they want based on goofy assessments of their land that were way undervaluing. That there was going to be a real way for the national government to raise money. So I often wonder about this counterfactual question. If that impost would have passed in 83, I think there's a likelihood that we would not have had Philadelphia because there's an independent stream of revenue that would have been created in 83. Now, that obviously is a full 4 years before 87.
Yeah.
So,
prior to days.
So I would say, did the Articles fail? Well, I would change the question slightly. The Articles failed to be amended. Now, Okay, I understand that that's a sleight of hand, but that Article 13 is I would suggest that's the problem, the inability to amend it. And those 6 failed attempts, I think, bear that out.
You know, for a man who doesn't like legalism and has a certain disdain for lawyers, you have a way with words that sounds very lawyerly. I got to say at times.
Fair enough.
There,
Fair enough.
Professor Moore.
I just started watching Better Call Saul, and Tim, you're right there, buddy. You're right there.
Professor Williams, I know this question is going to seem, overly juvenile in some ways. I don't know, because it's just so obvious. But what I was thinking about today is it's at the very core of our republic. It's the major problem in the Philadelphia Convention, but it's a problem that we've never been able to come up with a solution to. That is, it's still a problem in the 21st century, in this decade. But if we can get your view of why is it so difficult, why is it such a major issue at Philadelphia, and that is representation. It is the major issue. Why do you see it as such a contentious issue?
Yeah, I'll go back to kind of the point that I think Chris and Tim are biting at the bit to sort of challenge me on. I think okay, there's 2 things going on. One is that there's this, I think, changing of this idea that democracy, some sort of democracy, can work. Like, the people need to have some sort of say that maybe they weren't having in the past at the national level. There's that kind of slow kind of change happening. And then, Chris's buddy, Jimmy Madison, he comes in and he drops this bombshell, right? With this Virginia plan, with this notion of setting up a bicameral, right, structure where all free people will have a chance to have their say, right? What we would now call the House of Representatives. And I think that those 2 things happen at the same time. I mean, this half of the summer is spent like trying to disentangle. How do we make terms with democracy if we're really going to have it? And there were some delegates who simply didn't want to have democracy, right? But once you kind of decide, okay, the people are going to have a say, then the question is not just do people get a say at the national level, but how do votes become power, right? How do individual votes become power? And that has to do with, okay, is it every state gets the same amount of votes? Is it that some states get more votes based on population? Is it based on land, who gets the vote? So I think once you open up the question or open up the possibility that individuals are going to have a say at the national level in a way that they have not had during the colonial experience and during the Articles, I think naturally then you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about how do we give power to those voices. So
that is kind of the historical conservative nature of government, in which the Americans, if we want to call them that at this point, inherit. Is that a major barrier? I mean, is that why the resistance to this democratic impulse of proportional representation is this? We don't have any precedents for this kind of system, and it seems like the conservative forces want to protect certain vested interests, and they sure neck don't want to turn power over to the general population. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I think there's a few things going on. There's the camp that's saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Or let's just fix the Articles. We don't need to come up with a whole new sort of system. There is the vested interest, you bet. As soon as you change the way representation happens, the way power kind of flows through the national system, there's going to be winners and losers. And everyone's kind of looking around to see, okay, who's going to be winning, who's going to be losing? Large states, small states, slave states, non-slave states, trade. And then, go ahead.
Well, we opened this discussion here with the principles of the revolution, and the principles of the revolution. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Mm-hmm. The idea then seems to me to be simple, that therefore there will be equal representation of people. What we learned in the 60s, one man, one vote kind of concept, And therefore, these more traditional institutions of representing land and in some ways noble interests are counterintuitive to the revolutionary principle.
Well, I mean, Americans know that they don't want virtual representation. That's a given. Now, it is ironic that in some parts of our Constitution, it
That's
comes
what they
perilously
get.
close to being that. But at a theoretical level, we don't want rotten boroughs, you know, where there's nobody there, but they have a representative. I mean, so Americans are generally in agreement. They don't want virtual representation. Well, I mean, to Mike's point, what actually does that look like? And so I would say that the unifying principle is we don't want virtual.
Yeah, and we can't, I mean, just because you have a revolutionary idea that all people are created equal, right? That doesn't magically then you can just get away from all of the historical structures that are there. So I think there's this, I mean, the compromise is about a lot of things, but it's a lot about how do we align with these, what I would consider this kind of new notion that the people are going to have some sovereignty, to get back to the point I made earlier, with this idea of local control, federalism, states want to control their boundaries, there's vested interest, there's different economic systems in the North and the South, and all of those players are in Philadelphia trying to make sure there's a place for them in this new system. So it's not going to be like an either or. We just can't like completely get rid of our 150, 200 years of self-rule. But there is a time, I think there is a time at the convention where they're trying to like cram in this relatively new idea that the people will be sovereign at the national level. And how do we create structures of power where that can happen?
Well, talking about structure, Tim, and I don't know if this is the radical nature of the Constitution or what, but what questions did the framers consider when they were designing the three branches of national government? I mean, is it purely Montesquieu? They're ripping on Montesquieu there, or what other things were they considering as they create these institutions or branches?
Well, it is interesting to me when you look at the chronology. They're most interested in the that institution of the legislature. I mean, they didn't. I mean, they don't even get around to fleshing out any details about the presidency till after they resolve the representation issue in the House. So, I mean, they're obviously wrestling with unicameralism versus bicameralism. In the 80s, that was kind of a debate amongst Americans, the Thomas Paine version, unicameralism. Georgia and Pennsylvania opted for that. Is it going to be unicameral or bicameral? So that's one of the things that drives the discussion, and that gets into proportionality and equal representation in upper and lower. The executive in many ways is an afterthought. They do both the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan state that it's the legislature is going to select the national executive. There are some differences. New Jersey thought maybe there could be a multiple executive, whereas the Virginia plan didn't. So they're wrestling with, again, their British history, and they're wrestling with their colonial variations too, as they create these institutions. And courts, they want local control in courts, because I come back to something I said earlier. That Administration of Justice Act in '75 was huge in terms of local control over courts.
Well,
go ahead, Chris.
Just to jump in for the students, you guys students watching this realize once you get into the curriculum that when the early state constitutions, many of them have weak executives because the power rests in the assembly or in the state legislature. And so, when you moved that and you fast forward to Philly in 1787, and they're thinking about designing the executive branch there, one, I think they've got an eye on, they know who's going to occupy the White House first, and we'll let him flesh things out once he gets in there, maybe. But two, it's like, so you're moving from these state constitutions with weaker executives to a national government with a somewhat weaker executive, where the legislature certainly is the dominant, as I understand, the framers believe would be the dominant branch.
So, okay,
I think
good.
there's one more institutional thing that I think gets I do know gets overlooked. The Articles of Confederation had a fairly rigorous committee system, largely because there was no single executive. So what I'm suggesting is the way the Articles operated in these committees, I think bears heavily on the minds of the folks at Philadelphia when they create this possibility of cabinet positions within the Constitution. They've seen these committees. Some people on those committees aren't even in Articles of Congress, but they're running these committees. So I think the fact that there's a bureaucracy that's operating under the Articles informs the thinking about creating the possibility of a bureaucracy in terms of the cabinet provided for in the Constitution. I don't think that's pointed out much in the history books.
So you're telling me, Tim, that there's an administrative state even before we have the Constitution?
Yeah, there is. Sorry, all you libertarians out there.
Well, I guess
Your only hope is it was a crappy one, but
well, if I understand correctly, what you're saying, what it seems the both of you are saying, is that they clearly wanted most of the power in the legislative branch. All right. They clearly were somewhat reticent of that. And so that's why they create some limitations to that power. But it seems to me, Chris, you're saying that they intended to create a weak executive. And is that the reason that they use such vague language? Or was the language of Article 2 such an afterthought that they didn't really care that much? But that's what opened the door to the 20th century imperial presidency and what we're dealing with today. Because today's presidency is nothing close to what I'm hearing you say they thought or wanted from an executive branch.
If we could bring back little Jimmy Madison and have him look at things today, he would not believe the system that we have today, or the way we operate. I shouldn't say the system. The system it is changed, but the way it operates is not anything what the framers intended. I mean, as Madison described Congress as the impetuous vortex, right? They know that's where the mischief would happen. And so I don't know whether they use vague language. I mean, the language, I think they quibble over language quite a bit at the convention and debate the language, which is good because language matters. But I'm not sure that there was an intentionality to leave things vague in terms of language within the Article 2. I know a friend of our program, Dr. David Adler, who's been on a couple times with us, would argue that he would say this is not vague in Article 2. He would argue that there are specific guidelines laid out for the president in Article 2. So
yeah, because the take care clause is pretty, it's just so easy to understand. And the commander in chief clause, those aren't vague.
Well, I mean, the take care clause is doing a lot of heavy lifting and has been doing a lot of heavy lifting for a while. The commander in chief clause is pretty straightforward because if you read the rest of it, it says when called into service, right? Well, we know that Congress Congress is allegedly supposed to do the calling. It's now kind of like, we'll let the president do it, right? So we've seen a feckless Congress many times give up the power and let the president do it because nature abhors a vacuum. And so the executive branch is going to step in and take that.
I mean, but it's connected, right? In the context of the 1780s, the notion of that the legislature would make the laws and the executive executes those laws. So if your assumption is that there's not going to be a lot for the national government to do, right? There's not going to be a lot of laws to execute. We don't have to be too worried about the person executing them because there's just not a lot happening. So a lot of this, in my estimation, is there's no way the founders could have envisioned the way the world was going to changed. I mean, the things that the legislative branch has claimed control over, or the problems it's tried to fix through the necessary and proper clause, maybe, right? And then the president now has the constitutional authority to execute all of these different things. So it's kind of connected. And a lot of the power the executive has right now is like Chris said, it's because the legislative branch has either turned a blind eye or they've simply passed acts saying, executive branch, we want you to do this because we don't want the political hot potato, right?
Well, it's worth reminding everyone that everybody knows about the big original constitutional fight right after the first government forms, and that's over the bank. But the second one, when Chris mentioned David Adler, it made me think about the second, I think, maybe more important constitutional fight was over executive power to declare neutrality, or whether Congress had a role in that. So there was an executive legislative fight within the first 2 years of our country under the Constitution. To this original point about, was there going to be a natural deference to your question, David? Was there going to be a natural deference to Congress? Well, right out of the chute, there's a fight over that power relationship, the Helvidius Pacificus debates, as they've been known.
And for the students watching, the Pacificus Helvidius debates are Hamilton and Madison mano a mano in writing, going back and forth about the power of the executive. One of my favorite things in that is Madison actually quotes Hamilton back to himself from one of the Federalist papers. And I think I'm trying to remember how Madison worded it, but he goes, this was an authority at the time that was highly and widely regarded on this matter. And so he quotes Hamilton back to himself about the power of the executive, which I think is just brilliant.
Well, we have talked for the entire time that we've been doing this program here, last almost couple of years now, that the nemesis that plagues us all is the federal system there. So, Chris, you get the job of trying to explain how the delegates decided to distribute power.
Have a good time, Chris. We'll see you later.
The national and state governments.
Well, I think it goes. Thanks, fellas. I think it goes back. And what did you just spin the wheel and that landed on me, Dave? Thanks a lot. I think
because I know that the word federal is one of your favorite Constitution words.
It's one of my favorite F words for sure.
Yeah.
Right up there with food and free. I think it goes back to the issue of sovereignty, right? And so, when you think about going to go back to the king and parliament, and then the colonies in parliament, and a revolution, now we are sovereign states, right? These sovereign states, and now we're creating a new national government, and we're asking people to say, hey, yeah, you guys had all this control in your state, now we need you to give some up to this new national government. We mentioned the courts earlier. Oh my God, we can't do that, right? And now, we're making, this body's going to be making laws that apply to everybody, and we don't even know anybody 10 miles down the road, let alone 3 or 4 states removed from us. So the idea is, I think you had to, whether it be Madison or others that favored a stronger national government, you have to, politics is compromise, right? Politics is compromise, and you had to be able to compromise in the creation of this document. You just can't wrest control away from these people that have been enjoying this control since 1774, since 1770, even prior under the colonial control, right? So now you're asking them to, meet the new boss, same as the old boss kind of thing. So you have to throw bones to them. You have to be able to say, okay, you know what? Look, the Constitution, if it's going to be amended, it's going to be amended by the states. Look, you guys get to elect your states. You guys get to elect the senators. Your state legislatures do this. And Madison, and was it Federalist 14 says it's not wholly federal, it's not wholly national. And he does that because I think you're trying to convince people to come along. And you're asking, this is a big change. And I don't know that I'd call the Constitution a radical document. I call it a reactionary document.
Well, is there clarity of thought as they go through? If we look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 through 17, is there some clarity there? I tried to explain to my students a very simple model. That which is local in nature stays with the states, and that which has a national flavor has to be taken care of. And in essence, it crosses state lines, and it involves multiple parties in this. Was there kind of some sense of that as they're articulating Article 1, Section 8, and those powers given to Congress, that all of those have to deal with a national flavor and therefore must be under the power of Congress? Everything else is.
I definitely agree, because all you have to do is look at Article 1, then Section 10, powers denied to the states, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at Article 1, Section 8, this is what the Congress gets to do, right? All, as David, you mentioned, 1 through 17, and the necessary and proper in there concludes that. But then you look at Article 1, Section 10, so these are what the states can't do. So I think you take those two together, because think about something as simple as printing and coining money, right? Who's going to decide who the currency? Well, it's going to be a national government. Sorry, states, we're taking that away from you. Not only are we giving the power to the national government, we're going to make sure in Article 1, Section 10, that we're going to tell you, you can't do this. Oh, by the way, same thing with weights and measures. So what's a bushel is going to be a bushel is going to be a bushel. A peck is going to be a peck is going to be a peck, right? In terms of, weighing these things. So I think that, you have to have some uniformity. Right. If you're going to truly have a nation, there has to be some uniformity. And we see that given Congress given these powers in Article 1, not just in Article 1, Section 8. Congress has powers throughout the document. Right.
But don't you think there's a clear dividing line, that those powers are clearly, all right, as you say, are meant to create uniformity, all right, and to create a national identity? Now, it seems the hiccup or the curveball that's thrown is Clause 18. All right. That seems to, kind of messy, create a mess of 1 through 17 to a certain degree. At least we see that historically. And I don't know if they anticipated the expansive understanding of commerce when they wrote that in the Constitution in 1787. But it seems to me that not only, you're right, Chris, not only Article 1, Section 8, but in numerous other areas there are powers of Congress. But it seems to me that those powers are logical and reasonable connections to uniformity and a national identity.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Tim, let me just jump in one more thought. Sorry. Look at, like, in Article 4, the full faith and credit clause. The whole idea of full faith and credit of acts, records, proceedings from one state will be given credence in another state. Marriage licenses are a big thing. But if you read on in full faith and credit, it tells you except where Congress has the ability to change that. So that's just an example of congressional power that it's not clearly articulated, because Congress down the road can decide you don't have to recognize that same-sex marriage license, right? Fast forwarding to DOMA. So Congress, my point is that Congress has a lot of power throughout the document. Sorry, Tim.
No, I think David's right that Article 1, Section 8 can largely be seen as a clear delineation section. But even within Article 1, Section 8, there's some federalism trade-offs in those military clauses. You have these local militias that can be called forth by the national government. There's this officer corps. There's local. So even in a section that David is rightly suggesting is a clear statement of this is ours, this is yours. The military statements are interesting to me because they're not so clear if you look at some of those details of how that power relates between the national and local when it comes to the militia and the military.
They seem clear to me. If I've got a local problem here in California that needs a militia, then the state has jurisdiction. But if if suddenly we got a foreign power, all right, threatening the nation, then yes, we're going to give it to Congress to call forth the state militias. That seems logical and reasonable to me, and a delineation of how military power will be used.
What if that military entity is another state, though? So I think on paper,
okay,
it looks a little cleaner, but I think in practice, I think it gets a little, to my way of looking at it, it gets a little fuzzy.
You guys better watch out. You guys in California better watch out for Nevada.
What do you mean? Most of California travels in Nevada, once a week. So, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just as I was prepping for this this discussion, I learned something that I'm sure all of you know, but I learned it, that you know, much of the convention was spent talking about these broad things of representation, right? And then they form, like, they have all these ideas out there. And so they decide to form this committee of the detail, right? That kind of goes away from July 26th to August 4th.
Yeah.
And they're meant to kind of like, okay, let's put this in language that we can actually more specific. And maybe what I read is incorrect on this, but it was out of this committee that we get the Electoral College, that
Yep.
we get these enumerated powers of Congress. So from August 6th through when they finally vote on it in September, they're having to debate a lot of details. So I found it just thinking about these people in this room, they're the entire summer. I know the students, we have this idea what it was like, but these things that now that we're debating, right, about the broader principles of federalism and these enumerated powers, and literally they just came out of the committee and they said, okay, we decided we're going to enumerate the powers. We decided we're going to make some decisions on slavery, although we're not going to use the word slavery, right? It just struck me as like, wow, there was a lot more to do in 5 weeks. And so some of this probably didn't get the kind of enlightened thought that we want to think that the founders were doing. They were literally just trying to get a final document maybe kind of done.
So you're saying it's like a rush job. It's like students that wait till the last minute and procrastinate.
As I was reading on this, it was kind of like they all decided to come to talk about, revising the articles. Here comes Madison with this like, boom, like the smart kid comes up with this huge idea and everyone just kind of like, what? We can't do all this stuff. They spend most of their time debating these big ideas and all of a sudden they realize, wow, we really need to get some people in a room and work on the details. And they come back with some very specific ideas that we are now living with today, like the Electoral College and enumerated powers, necessary and proper, I think gets thrown in after that. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, I am curious, Mike. Obviously, okay, it's not the Constitution yet. It's been signed off in Philadelphia by not every delegate, but it's been signed off and it's going to be sent to the states. And in that process, we break into two groups. And I'm curious when it comes to the major debates between what will be called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and their debates seem to be over, again, representation, the notion of union, the nature of union and rights. Do you see this division as a byproduct of ideology, or is it more geography? I'm just curious, is there an ideological, this is all about, our ideas about what government should look like, or is it just a byproduct of where I live? Kind of like, today we find rural urban, split has a definite effect on people's political outlook there. Is that your read of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or you see it as ideological?
Well, to borrow from our economist today, Tim Moore, who on the one hand, on the other, yes and no. I'll do with like it's both those and it's one other thing, I think. So I think that what we're wrestling with at this time is two major questions, like what is actually possible and then what is actually desired. And I think that what is desired, the Federalists are coming at this from the point of view, they can't find one historical example of what they are proposing will actually work, right? But they're making the argument, this is what we need to do. This is desired. In a world where there's going to be big, powerful states coming after us, we have got to get our house in order. We've got to secure this national project, right? And they're the what we'll call the Anti-Federalists, who just look at experience and they say, well, we've never done anything like this before. No one's tried anything like this before. It's not desirable for us to have this national union, and it's not possible. So I think that there is a notion of what had been tried. I think there's a notion of ideology. And then, I think it's a notion of geography. And I don't think Madison left the convention and kind of, I think he wrote something to the effect of, the divide in this country is not north-south, it is really slave and non-slave, right? But I think that even these divisions over one's identity to a local area. I think even in the North, you have people that would resonate with more so than this idea of this national thing, this national project. So I think it was all those things kind of coming together at once.
Well, I just for fun, I looked at a traditional middle school textbook this week, and I think this is something that is consistent. The way that it's presented in a lot of textbook is large state versus small state. All right. Yet when I looked at a map of where Federalists, Anti-Federalists fall, I don't even know who the large states and small states are in this sense. So I'm wondering, anybody who wants to address that, is that too simple of a model to say large state, small state?
Well, I think for middle school, you got to start the conceptual discussion somewhere. So I think for middle school, that's appropriate. Now, it doesn't tell the full story to how I would see it, but I mean, it is a decent starting point, large state, small state, because if they gather in Philadelphia and they're to Mike's point talking about representation most of the time, that's a big state, small state. That's a populous state or not.
Isn't it accurate, Professor Moore? I mean, New York is one of the most resistant states, and I would say they're a large state.
Correct, and that's why I think the middle school text needs a little bit of explanation. Exactly. Exactly.
So you also see. By the way, David, was this in between all the chapters on CRT? I didn't know in the middle school textbook. I'd throw that out there with a straight face, but. For New York too, you see a split in New York as well.
Yep.
I mean, going back to what David, you just said, the urban-rural split. You got a city people like Hamilton, holy cow, the child of New York City, and you got upstate contingency. So there's a split within the state of New York as well between rural and urban. I don't think that's an oversimplification for middle school. Certainly, maybe when you get into senior government, you want to have some more nuances because. Mike dropped the line from Madison's notes. Madison says it's not going to be between the large states and the small states. As Mike said, it's going to be between the states with slaves and states without. I mean, it's like he's looking into his crystal ball almost and predicting, the Civil War and the lead up to it. So I think there are nuances to come into play.
Could you and Mike explain that to me? So, those advocates for slavery, are they the Anti-Federalists? Or
well, they're not advocates. They're not necessarily advocates for slavery. They're advocates in terms of representation, because their argument is, well, we have these people, but we're not treating them like people, but we're going to call them people because we want to have more representation. Then you get some people in the North, they're like, whoa. Why are you saying they're people now, but you don't treat them as people? So I think it really goes back to the representation debate.
Well, they're debating the Constitution as it comes out of Philadelphia, and that Constitution gives 3/5 representation for the purposes of taxation and representation. So I'm trying to figure, like I said, I'm still a little bit confused. And isn't it New England states are pretty quick, other than Rhode Island, out of the gate to ratify? Like I said, I'm trying to figure out if the issue of slavery and representation is the issue, who's who? Who's the Federalists and who's the Anti-Federalists?
Well, Anti-Federalists are split on slavery. There's a geographic split there. There's all kinds of Northern Anti-Federalists that are opposed to the Constitution on slavery issues. And there's all kinds, and it flips in the South. So there's not a unified position amongst Anti-Federalists on slavery. That is geographic. To your point.
So is there an ideological component here, just kind of based on the general power of the central government? That's a fault line that divides them?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, again, we could argue that in today's parties, well, I don't know, because I one of the parties, I'm so confused. When I was growing up, all right, especially in the 1970s, the Republicans tended to campaign on less governmental power at the national level, and the Democrats wanted an activist national government emanating, maybe to some degree from FDR and his coalition. That was an ideological thing, the role of government. Is that similar in the Federalist Anti-Federalist debate?
I would say, yeah. And it's not so, they're divided on what level of government can best achieve rights, what level of government can best achieve these outcomes. And so there is an ideological difference in the source, what level of government would get these, and that they agree on that there are rights. They agree that there should be good representation. They agree on those things. They just differ. There's an ideological difference on the mechanism to achieve those.
I think of, I just flash and I was like listening to you, Tim. I was thinking, is that John Patrick or John Kaminsky that I heard years and years and years ago in Bloomington saying the feds and anti-feds wanted the same things. They just disagreed about how to get there, right? Who's going to do it. And I keep thinking of John Marshall's autobiography, because he was with Washington at Valley Forge, and he writes in his autobiography that there were men from every, he talked about men from every state. Clearly, what we're fighting for is a new nation and a conglomerate of states. And so I do think there's an ideological kind of divide here. Who's going to be best suited for putting these things into action, whether it's going to be a national government or states governments on their own.
Yeah, and I guess
which goes back to the question you asked me about federalism, because there is such an ideological divide, you end up having to compromise, right? You have to be able to allow states to continue to act as they were doing to a degree, with now a paternalistic government in Philadelphia, New York, D.C.
Yeah, and I guess my message to students and teachers is that this Federalist Anti-Federalist issue is far more complex than a lot of textbooks present there. And I think the light came on for me. It was actually Professor Will Harris at a professional development, I think at Pepperdine University, that talked about a conflict within a consensus. They had a consensus on these big ideas, but they had a conflict, as I think Tim illustrated, on the details of how to, make these ideas come to life: Republican government representation, the nature of union, and things like that. And so, just students understand, and Tim, you said it. The Anti-Federalists themselves were split. They were Anti-Federalists, but they were split North and South over the issue of slavery, which therefore makes it a really interesting alliance and how these alliances form over the ratification of the Constitution.
David, let me just, I'm sorry, Mike.
No,
just jump in really quickly. And I think that for the people that are just watching our program for the first time, we've said this on numerous occasions. I think we all rankle at the idea that there's this monolithic thought. This is what the Anti-Federalists believe. This is what the Federalists believe. This is what the founders believe. This is what the framers believe. And we know that there's such varied opinions within each of those groups that I just mentioned, that there's no idea that we can just say there's just this monolithic idea that this is, the Anti-Federalist, mantra, and you have to stick to it, because there are divisions within every one of those groups. Sorry, Mike.
No, I agree with that. I also want to point out that on par, though, at least during the ratification, the Federalists were more organized. They weren't completely organized. They were more organized than the Anti-Federalists, which is one of the reasons politically the Anti-Federalists don't win those arguments. But to Tim's point earlier, as soon as we get our first government, right, we have Federalists who immediately start disagreeing with each other on how to actually implement the Constitution. So the Federalists did a better job of staying together, I think, during the ratification than the Anti-Federalists, which had an important role to play there. But they were not monolith, either group.
Hey, Tim, could you briefly, just to dovetail with what Mike said, because I know we've talked about this before, could you briefly mention media control between Fed and anti-Fed?
Oh, yeah. There's something like anywhere from 90 to 100 papers, which is the medium during ratification. And about 70 of them are editors that are Federalists. So the anti, which means, and there's kind of an unofficial wire service too, the way newspapers circulate around the country. So there's a lot of organization and agreement amongst those that are controlling the media. And there are a few Federalist editors that will print anti-Federalist essays in their papers. Many won't, but there's very few anti-Federalist papers, newspaper editors, I might say. So yeah, there's definitely a stilting on the messaging.
There's another theme that hasn't changed in over 200 years. Media consolidation under one ideological group there. So, Chris, I wanted to ask you, and again, we just because there's a few controversies that are highlighted, in the We the People topics that kids are asked to discuss, and one of those is the Electoral College there, and so. And it seems, and it goes back to the very beginning of this discussion. We're going to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. All right, sovereignty is going to be given to the people to some degree, much more than the Articles there. So how do we reconcile the creation of the Electoral College in this so-called revolutionary government in which the people are going to have sovereignty?
Well, I don't agree with that premise. I think the people might have had more sovereignty under the Articles than they do under the Constitution, but that's a whole nother can of worms. The Electoral College was, oh my God. Let's go back to Mike's committee of detail, right? We gotta elect this guy. How are we gonna do it? I don't know. Maybe we should. Well, people aren't gonna be well read enough to be able to pick this, and plus the fact that running a campaign on a national level is just crazy. So maybe we should just leave it up to the states to come up with these electors, And so this was just done.
Well, I'm just curious, were they aware of the potential problem?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
Yep.
I'm going to write my list of things down. I'll send it in the Founders Constitution. It's online, University of Chicago.
Yep.
One of my students found this for me several years ago. We were actually prepping for a question on the Electoral College, and this kid found a letter that Hamilton wrote to Wilson in Pennsylvania. And so here's Hamilton, he's getting behind the Electoral College and explaining why this is a good thing. But then in a letter, and it was at Fed 60 something, he's talking about the Electoral College, and he's, it's better than sliced bread or the mulching lawnmower or paper towels or something like that. I don't know. Those are all great inventions, by the way. I'm just gonna say.
What was that?
Those are all great inventions. Paper towels.
Okay, yeah.
The mulching lawnmower.
That's the committee of sub-details, a mulching lawnmower.
But then he writes this letter to Wilson saying, hey, we all know that this is not all that great. We know that there's problems here. And I'm worried that people are already doing some things. So I've already sent some letters to people around, and I need for you to work your magic in Pennsylvania to make sure that that boy Adams doesn't get more votes than he should in this thing, because we know that it could be kind of screwy. So they knew, right? They knew, and I'll send you a link and references so we can put that in our after thing, that there was an issue clearly with the Electoral College.
So,
well, I guess it befalls me to make a full-throated defense of the Electoral College. So here we go. You're using the Lincoln quote, David, as though that was an operating principle to founding, and it's not. There's this phrase that pops up occasionally amongst scholars. They look, we have a country where the people are sovereign, but they don't rule. So therefore, if you accept that, and that's a debatable point, but if you accept that principle, you're going to have filtering. Because let's face it, very few of the founders are interested in democracy. They're interested in people's sovereignty, but not, what exactly that means, we're not sure. But we do not want them running stuff. And that's why there's going to be a filtering. And that's why we have this Electoral College, because there's a distrust of the masses. And I think history has proven that, I'm not a big fan of I'm not a small d Democrat in that sense. So there's got to be filtering, and that's the whole Madisonian system. Whether we like that or not, the Madisonian system says we are going to filter. People are sovereign, but they don't rule. And electoral college is, I think, a symptom of that theory.
Okay, agreed. And in fact, there's maybe a little bit more European feudalism, nobility, rule by nobility in the American constitutional system that many people want to recognize.
It's a good point. It's a good point.
But beyond that, the Electoral College is not just about, does it reflect the will of the people? All right. But is it going to allow scalawags to be able to get their body into the West Wing and into the Oval Office and govern? I mean, that's again, more of a concern. And I think we would all agree that we got a lot of scalawags who end up being president. And a lot of that has to do with the Electoral College method there. Mike, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, Tim's comment made me think of something, because if we take as the premise that the real power in the 1780s was going to be in the House of Representatives, going to be in the Congress. So this idea of filtering the Electoral College, I completely agree with Tim. I just was thinking about, okay, so what's the filter for the House of Representatives? And I guess this is more of a, because they know that that's where the power is. And is it that the states have the ability to then determine the elections of those folks? Could students see that as another filtering system, that the filtering is going to happen down low or not? Does that make sense?
It's also going to be filtered at the state level when the state legislatures determine who's in the Senate.
Well, of course, I'm just thinking about
the Senate will act as that check on the.
Right, Mike. I was thinking the same thing, Mike. But it seems to me, and Chris has touched on it, the filter of the House is the Senate. Right, that the Senate will tone down the extremism of the House. But I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting notion that the states themselves will have powers to somehow filter who sits in the House.
Well, they determine how the manner of the elections. So you're giving the state elites the ability to set up the system about who would actually then be able to get into that. I was just thinking along those lines. I never thought of that as a filter. So now I'm just throwing it out to the group. I don't
see it as a filter. I see it as a check. Washington's famous explanation about the cup and the saucer. For students that haven't heard this, it's been used quite a bit. That the house is the cup where you pour the hot liquid into, whether it's tea or coffee, I'm not sure, and then you pour it into the saucer to cool it, and that's the Senate. So the Senate acts as not necessarily a filter, I would say, but more of a check on the House. And it goes back to what Tim has said too. It's a Madisonian model. You're going to expand the sphere, take in a greater degree of talent. I put air quotes around talent at that level.
To Mike's point, you made earlier, theory versus what can we get passed? What can we get ratified? The fact is, we're stuck with states. We have a legacy of local state sovereignty. We're stuck with that at the founding. And so the Electoral College is, in that sense, a predictable outcome of that commitment to state entities. We're stuck with that. There's no way they can bargain out of that at that time. And we've had to live with that, as much as we don't like the Electoral College or the Senate. But they were stuck with it, I think, at the founding.
Yeah.
So, Mike, I know that, in the last couple of years, you've done a lot of reading about a topic in which many people in this country, governors, don't want us to be reading about. Chris mentioned earlier CRT. And I'd hate to be a teacher these days and trying to figure out what I can and can't teach in certain states, especially when it comes to slavery. And I'm wondering what your thoughts. Do you think, because we are told in textbooks that there was a debate over slavery, at the Philadelphia Convention. Do you think it was a real debate, or was it just kind of a cursory exercise? And it really had nothing to do with the institution of slavery. It had more to do with political power associated with slavery.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I think that I read what's happening, and it's mostly like my reading of this, and Tim and Chris, check me on this. It's really like late to mid to late August, where you see a lot of debates specifically on slavery. But it's not on the issue of, are we going to have slavery or not? I think that even those at the convention who maybe wished for that outcome, they knew that Georgia and the Carolinas, they would just walk away if that were on the table. So the debates around slavery are really about, okay, so we've made this decision on representation. What do we do with the 500,000 slaves? How do we count them in terms of representation? How do we count them in terms of taxation, right? So slavery is debated in the context of representation. What do we do about the slave trade, right? Do we have a ban on the slave trade? At this point, there's many know that slavery itself, unlike in the Caribbean and in South America, slavery can continue for generations and generations just because slaves are living longer and they're having children that are born into slavery. So it's not like in other parts of the world where literally you needed the slave trade to keep slavery going. So that's why there is the compromise that we're going to have slavery for 20 years, right? And then we'll vote on it. And then finally, what do we do about slaves who run away? Like, to what extent are they forced to come back? So the discussions we had on slavery were really on how slavery implicated political power or economic power. It wasn't on the question of slavery itself. At least that's my reading of what was going on there. But I'm going to defer to Chris and Tim because they have much more knowledge about this period than I do.
No, I agree, Mike. It wasn't the moral issue of slavery was really not on the table as much as the political issue of what to do with enslaved, how to deal with enslaved people. You know, and certainly that 20-year time period before 1808 rolls around and the international slave trade is abolished, will give the practitioners the time to breed more enslaved people. And then, of course, when you do away with the international slave trade in 1808, which is put forward by Jefferson, right? His enslaved population becomes much more valuable, right, by doing away with the international slave trade. But in 1787, when these debates are happening, it's a political issue, not a moral issue, unfortunately.
In some ways, I think the ratification debates, there's more of a substantive debate about slavery on its face. Because there are so many people that look at the provisions that Mike mentioned, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the 1808, and even representation. There's a pretty rigorous substantive moral debate about slavery in the Constitution. I mean, and there's a lot of interesting sermons, but not just amongst religious groups, although the Quakers lead the charge on this. But how can we? There's two kinds of argument. There's kind of the secular argument. How can we have said in the Declaration what we said, and then have slaves? And then there's the religious rhetoric that this is a violation of human dignity and being created in the image of God. So I'd say the ratification, you see more of the substantive discussion about slavery.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up, and what I'd like to do is, because although this unit seems simple with a really short title there, it is, hopefully you've gathered, students, teachers, that it is rather complex. But to my other friends of Publius here, I'd like you to give a suggestion or a thought or an insight about the creation of the Constitution you would encourage students to try to get their hands on or their hands around as they continue their studies. So, Professor Williams, any thoughts about the creation?
I mean, but just to your point, David, I can't imagine anyone to have a career based on studying this topic. Like, what else is there to know? I mean, it's all there in Unit 2. So, sorry, Professor Moore. I would.
Oh,
Nice.
Tim. Oh, Tim. There's those tire tracks right across your back.
I would bring up something that we haven't brought up tonight. Well, we did a little bit. I would have students. What I reflect on is that we are not a country with one constitution. We have been a country with multiple constitutions, but unlike a country like France that calls out the First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic, we don't do that. And I think it affects how we even think about the Constitution and think about the founders. It wasn't one moment and it wasn't one document. We have been experimenting throughout history, and I think there's an argument to be made that there are different republics. We have different constitutional arrangements, both before 1787 and after 1787. That's my first point. My second point is that I think we did a really good job tonight talking about how these debates don't start in the summer of 1787. These are debates that have been going on since the 1770s, maybe at least since the early 1780s. And when we think about promoting democracy abroad, promoting constitutional democracy abroad, if our expectation is that a country can draft a constitution, get it settled, get it implemented, all within a tight time period of 3 to 6 months or even a year, we're kidding ourselves, and we're not relying upon our own constitutional experience where these things take years to do, and it takes a lot of experimentation. That I think we need to reflect on that as we look out and see what other countries are trying to do as they set up their own democratic constitutional governments.
Chris?
Mike, I really liked your point about we have multiple constitutions, right? And our national constitution, I would argue, has been several different constitutions. And we know that is true, especially when you look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the 19th Amendment and other amendments. It's going to change who the us is, right, in terms of things. I think for students watching this, and I want to go back to what Tim mentioned, the Pacificus Helvidius debates, and I always use this with my students. Here's Madison, here's Hamilton, two guys that wrote the damn thing, two guys that supported his ratification, even though Madison really kind of comes away from the convention as a losing more than he wins. But he's arguing in favor of this document because he believes it's the best hope we have for moving forward as a nation. But as soon as the rubber meets the road in the first administration, the Washington administration, two guys that were there on the ground, deeply involved in this, they're going to argue about which way to go. So if these two guys are going to argue about which way to go, how are we not supposed to? All these years later, with all the history that we've had, how are we not going to argue about its interpretation and its application? I mean, I think it was Edmund Morgan talked about, the great historian Edmund Morgan said the Constitution was, in terms of foreign policy, was an invitation to argument. I would simply say interpreting the Constitution is an invitation to argument, right? In spite of what Mike just said about spending one's life in terms of studying this and this time frame kind of thing. I don't.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I think Mike and Chris's point about experimentation may be the most important thing. I think for some reason, we get into this mode where things are static and fixed. Our sagacious founding fathers kind of hover 6-8 inches above the ground, and they were experimenting, and in that sense they're very British in how constitutionalism worked for them. They were experimenting, they were making it up as they were going. What could we get past? There were theorists among them, but they're experimenting. So I think both Mike and Chris are on to something there. When you think about the founding period and the creation of the Constitution, it was an experiment. The other thing I would suggest, if you do want to make a career of this sad thing, what was interesting to me when I first got interested in this period is there's like schools of thought about the convention. There's one school of thought that they were all driven by their pocketbooks. There's one school of thought that they were all Christians. There's one school of thought that said, they were truly acting as bargaining politicians. So if you really want to get into this, research a little bit about the schools of interpretation about what's going on at the convention. I found that to be particularly fascinating, and it kind of disabused me of this notion that there's this static interpretation of what went on. And I think the convention is one of those great moments in our history where it's rife with interpretation. And I would invite students and people in general to maybe read a couple of books about the convention. You'll get different perspectives, and I think that's healthy.
Well, I'd like to, students and teachers, for you to think. Both Mike and Tim have used the word experiment, and my view is the experiment is perpetual. It's ongoing, and as in thinking about our episode today, I was thinking about just how interesting it is that we're still having the same debates. We're having the debate about presidential power. We're having the debate about personhood and liberty. We're having the debate about Congress and representation, gerrymandering and electoral. We're still having the same dang debates that they were in 1787, 88, and throughout our history. So try not to look at this as a study of a bunch of dead white guys and a dead document from the 18th century. All of this is very relevant because, and again, I sense some disagreement on the panel here. But in the last analysis, it does seem like the framers tried to give decision-making to some degree to we, the people, and therefore we have to have knowledge and understanding of the past in order to kind of have some sense of where we head to in the future. So we'll wrap that up for this week. The next time that you see us, we'll be talking about change of this Constitution and how this Constitution has changed over time to try to live up to the ideals in the Declaration of Independence. So until that, enjoy your summertime. Peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-byes.